I think the problem is so many of us as clinicians, we are not trained in autism unless we seek out specific trainings. We are not. And that, in that sense, I wouldn't even trust, like someone said, I asked my therapist if I could have autism, and we're talking about high masking. I might say, unless they're a specialist, I wouldn't necessarily trust their response. And that's just my opinion, because of all that I'm learning right now and all the videos I watch and articles I'm reading. And so I just want to say that if you're someone on the spectrum, please like hold me accountable and share and teach, but also make space for the fact that we can't become experts unless we're willing to make mistakes and learn and put ourselves out there. And this is something that I really do want to understand. And I understand now that trauma is inherent for most people with autism. And I've had people post on my videos and say, hey, Dr. Sage, have you checked out what used to be called Asperger's for yourself? And it's like a scary thing to even consider. Like I said, I didn't want to do this because I thought, oh, that's too vulnerable, but that's exactly why I want to do it. I want to take you with me on this journey. But I'm so glad you're here. I hope you'll join me, and please have some compassion when I screw up, but also feel free to hold me accountable. I'm learning so much about the dynamics between high masking autism, specifically as it relates to complex PTSD, and how those two, in general, autism and trauma, seem to just hold hands. But one of the things I came across, which really relates to how much I talk about complex trauma in Dr. Devin Price's book called Unmasking Autism, is the concept of fawning. Now, if you know a lot about complex trauma, you know that fawning, first discussed by Pete Walker in his book on complex PTSD, is really about trying to make yourself less threatening by being appealing to the threat. Except for in many cases, in terms of childhood trauma, that threat is often our own parents or our caregivers. And so we're trying to rotate around them and sort of mirror back that outside in orientation where we sort of read them first and then decide how to respond. And it's got me thinking about this fawning, let's say in a complex PTSD family with a lot of like eggshell parents, and the concept of this masking and fawning in autism, how difficult it would be to separate those, especially if, let's say, you came into the world with autism genetically, and now you are in a childhood where it actually benefits you to do those two things, to mask for your own self in terms of safety, and to mask in terms of finding ways to be more acceptable, like no matter what. So in his book, there's a graphic and he talks about fawning and compulsive people pleasing. And I talk so much about compulsive caretaking and complex trauma. And he says that people with autism tend to fawn because it earns the autistic person praise. It offers a false promise of acceptance. It simplifies complicated relationship dynamics, right? If I just take myself out of it and make it about you. It flattens social interactions into one easy rule. Always say yes. Validates the autistic person's belief they should ignore their feelings and needs, and minimizes conflict and reduces anger. And that just feels really difficult to sort of map out. How do you start to look at, why your fawning behaviors are what they are? Of course, what I'm trying to do now is get back to the roots and understanding the side of ASD, not just the side of complex trauma as it overlaps. And then what's fascinating is thinking about, regardless of ASD or complex PTSD, this is a response to trauma, to not being able to be your real and full self because for whatever reasons, that's not possible. And how we take these patterns and they affect every single areas of our life where we don't even necessarily know how to show up as who we are. It's just interesting, Autistic women and gender minorities. Most of the writing and research about gender-based disparities in autism focuses on the fact that girls are woefully underdiagnosed. Researchers, therapists, and even some autistic self-advocates talk about female autism, pointing to the fact that among girls, autistic qualities do seem less severe or obvious on average. When autistic girls engage in self-stimulatory behavior, it tends to be less physically damaging, less arm biting, more hair twirling or opening and closing a book quietly many times. When autistic girls are shy and withdrawn, people are less concerned by it than they would be if a boy exhibited the same reticence. On the flip side, when autistic girls have meltdowns, it tends to get written off as an emotional outburst. When they do act out or behave aggressively, they're more likely to be punished severely for not being ladylike, resulting in them learning to censor their aggression at an earlier age than most boys do. Adults speak to young girls using more emotion-related words than they do when speaking to boys. Autistic girls often get a leg up in social and relational skills. Much of the play that girls stereotypically engage in and are encouraged to engage in involves mimicking adult social interactions, such as playing house or pretending to run a store. As a result, many autistic girls learn how to fake their way through routine conversations at a younger age than boys do. For these and a variety of other reasons, autistic girls are assessed and diagnosed at later ages, at older ages. Many are diagnosed as adults or are never diagnosed at all. Below is a table summarizing some of the most well-known female autism traits. It's adapted from a list originally published on the now-defunct site Help for Asperger's, which was maintained by the author of The Girls Aspergirls, Rudy Simone, and is by no means an exhaustive list and shouldn't be taken as a diagnostic tool. As I've already mentioned, the idea that all women have female autism is a reductive one. Still, clinicians often fall back on tables like these to determine if an adult woman might potentially be an undiagnosed autistic. So here are some things to be cognizant of. Traits commonly associated with female autism. Next video. If someone is aware that a phenomenon such as female autism exists, they're often taught it looks something like this. These are the traits commonly associated with female autism. Number 1, emotional. Strikes others as emotionally immature and sensitive. Prone to outbursts or crying jacks, sometimes over seemingly small things. Has trouble recognizing or naming one's feelings. Ignores or suppresses emotions until they bubble up and explode. May become disturbed or overwhelmed when others are upset, but uncertain how to respond or support them. Goes blank and seems to shut down after prolonged socializing or when overstimulated. These are the psychological issues. Reports a high degree of anxiety, especially social anxiety. Is perceived by others as moody and prone to bouts of depression. May have been diagnosed with mood disorders such as bipolar or PDs like borderline or narcissistic PD before autism was discovered. Fears rejection intensely and tries to manage how other people feel to avoid it. Has an unstable sense of self, perhaps highly dependent on the opinions of others. These are the behavioral symptoms. Uses control to manage stress, follows intense self-imposed rules, despite having an otherwise unconventional personality. Is usually happiest at home or in a familiar, predictable environment. Seems youthful for their age in looks, dress, behavior, or interests. Prone to excessive exercise, calorie restriction, or other eating disordered behaviors. Neglects physical health until it becomes impossible to ignore. Self-soothes by constantly fidgeting, listening to repetitive music, twirling hair, picking skin, or cuticles. Social. Is a social chameleon, adopts the mannerisms and interests of the groups they're in. May be highly self-educated, but will have struggled with social aspects of the college or career. Can be very shy or mute, and yet can become very outspoken when discussing a subject they are passionate about. Struggles to know when to speak in large groups or at parties, does not initiate conversations but can appear outgoing and comfortable when approached. Can socialize, but primarily in shallow, superficial ways that may seem like a performance, struggles to form deeper friendships, has trouble disappointing or disagreeing with someone during a real-time conversation. Now, this type can apply to anyone, and they talk about this, saying that there's a particular way the neurotype tends to present among people who are discovered late in life as autistic. We tend to be emotionally withdrawn, yet friendly and socially adaptive. We're social chameleons and masters at making people like us, but we never let much of our real selves show. We erect rigid rules around our lives to manage stress and make an unpredictable social world feel less scary. Okay, let's get into Samantha Craft's list to help inform everyday practitioners about possible profiles and diagnostic criteria that are not in the DSM-5, but that might reflect a profile of autism. I'm a licensed psychologist. This person is not a licensed mental health professional, but does have an advanced degree in education, and many, many, many autistic people have shared that these lists that she has created are very helpful. So let's get into it. Now she says to check all areas that strongly apply. If each area has between 75 to 80% of the statements or more that are basically endorsed or checked yes, you may want to consider that the person may be autistic. So I am not saying that these traits make you autistic. I'm just giving you more data from the autistic voices in the community that I'm listening to in lots of places, research, articles, websites, podcasts, to help you understand yourself more and to talk about this topic more. Okay, let's get started. Also, don't forget that in any diagnosis like this, they're going to be looking at a much larger picture: childhood history, social history, relational histories. There's going to be a lot more than also just these traits. Okay, let's go. The first area is deep thinkers. Number one, a deep thinker, a prolific writer or artist drawn to poetry or art. Highly intelligent. Don't forget, highly intelligent does not relate to IQ levels. Autistic individuals are often dyslexic and have dysgraphia and other learning disabilities, but can be highly intelligent in particular subject matters. So the next one is sees things at multiple levels, including her own thinking processes, analyzes existence, the meaning of life, and everything continually. Serious and matter-of-fact in nature, doesn't take things for granted, doesn't simplify, everything is complex, and often gets lost in one's own thoughts and checks out like a blank stare. Section B, innocent, naive, honest, experiences trouble with lying, finds it difficult to understand manipulation and disloyalty, finds it difficult to understand vindictive behavior and retaliation, easily fooled and conned, feelings of confusion and being overwhelmed, feelings of being misplaced and or from another planet, feeling like an alien. I've talked about that a lot. Feelings of isolation, abused or taken advantage of as a child, but didn't think to tell anyone. Go to part 2. Part 2 of Samantha Craft's lists on what can create potentially an autistic profile. Let's keep going to part C. Section C, escape and friendship. Survives overwhelming emotions and senses by escaping in thought or action. Escapes regularly through fixations, obsessions, and over-interest in subjects. Escapes routinely through imagination, fantasy, and daydreaming. Escapes through mental processing. Escapes through the rhythm of words. Philosophizes continually. Had imaginary friends in youth. Imitates people on television or in movies. Treated friends as pawns in youth. Example, friends were students, consumers, members. Makes friends with older or younger females more so than friends her age, often in young adulthood. Imitates friends or peers in style, dress, attitude, interests, and manner, sometimes speech. Obsessively collects and organizes subjects. Mastered imitation. Escapes by playing the same music over and over. Say the same movies also. Escapes through a relationship, real or imagined. Numbers bring ease. Numbers could be numbers associated with patterns, calculations, list time, and or personification. Escapes through counting, categorizing, organizing, rearranging. Escapes into other rooms at parties. Cannot relax or rest without many thoughts. Everything has a purpose. Part 5, finds refuge when alone. Feels extreme relief when doesn't have to go anywhere, talk to anyone, answer calls, or leave the house, but at the same time will often harbor guilt for hibernating and not doing what everyone else is doing. One visitor in the home may be perceived as a threat. This could even be a family member or friend. Knowing logically a house visitor is not a threat doesn't still relieve the anxiety. Feelings of dread about upcoming events and appointments on the calendar. Knowing she has to leave the house causes anxiety from the moment she wakes up. All the steps involved in leaving the house are overwhelming and exhausting to think about. She prepares herself mentally for outings, excursions, meetings, and appointments, often days before a scheduled event. OCD tendencies when it comes to concepts of time, being on time, tracking time, recording time, and managing time. Could be carried over to money as well. Questions next steps and movements continually. Sometimes feels as if she's on a stage being watched, and or a sense of always having to act out the right steps even when she's at home alone. Telling the self the right words and or positive talk, like CBT, doesn't typically alleviate anxiety. CBT may cause increased feelings of inadequacy. Knowing she is staying home all day brings great peace of mind. Requires a large amount of down or alone time. Feels guilty after spending a lot of time on a special interest. Uncomfortable in public locker rooms, bathrooms, and or dressing rooms. Dislikes being in a crowd, crowded gym, crowded mall, crowded theater. Okay, let's continue with section G, sensitive. Sensitive to sounds, textures, temperature, and or smells when trying to sleep. Adjust bedclothes, bedding, and or environment in an attempt to find comfort. Dreams are anxiety-ridden, vivid, complex, and or precognitive in nature. Highly intuitive to others' feelings. Highly empathetic, sometimes to the point of confusion. Takes criticism to heart. Longs to be seen, heard, and understood. Questions if she is a normal person. Highly susceptible to outsiders' viewpoints and opinions. At times adapts her view of life or actions based on others' opinions or words. Recognizes own limitations in many areas of daily life, if not hourly. Becomes hurt when others question or doubt her work. Views many things as an extension of self. Fears others' opinions, criticism, and judgment. Dislikes words and events that hurt animals and people. Collects or rescues animals, often in childhood. Huge compassion for suffering, sometimes for inanimate objects, personification. Sensitive to substances, environmental toxins, food, alcohol, medication, hormones, etc. Tries to help, offers unsolicited advice, or formalizes a plan of action. Questions life purpose and how to be a better person. Seeks to understand abilities, skills, and or gifts. You just need to stop overreacting. Oh my God, you're so sensitive. Get over it. Just let it go. Why are you like this? Everything is not a level 10. If you've heard some version of this from your parents, your kids, your partners, there's a chance that along with the signs I'm going to discuss today, you are a highly sensitive person. Now, there's been a lot made about this topic, but I cannot emphasize it enough, especially when you may come from a more difficult childhood, a childhood that either didn't recognize your emotional needs, minimized them, disregarded them, told you you were weak, or made you feel that you didn't matter because you were too emotional, and or, grew up with a parent or parents who were intense, aggressive, loud, even parents who just were loud when they spoke, or they yelled a lot, or they just went around the world with really no real awareness of themselves, making noise, putting on loud music, clanging and banging and all things like that. You might have been overly affected as a child if you were and are an overly sensitive person. Now, the research shows that about 20% of us in the population have this quality, these qualities, these superpower qualities, I think they are, but they do and can make the world a more difficult place. So about 70% of us are introverts and about 30% of us are extroverts. And this really does come from a sensitive gene and a few other genetic markers that seem to be in alignment with having these qualities. And so you come out of the womb like this. This isn't something that happens to you as a result of your childhood. It is part of who you are. You think too much about everything and everyone. You are in your head a lot. You are thinking about things. You are processing them. Actually, you're a very deep processor. And as a result of this, it can make you struggle to make decisions. It can make you overly conscientious and caring. It can actually make you get bored in shallow conversations, even in your own relationships. And you often have this very intense, creative, rich interior world and imagination. So you are in your head and you tend to think about everything and everyone a lot of the time. In fact, pretty much all of the time. Number 2 is that you feel too much. You are in the feels about everything all of the time. You're often highly empathic. You tend to read people. You tend to be overly aware of their needs and what they're feeling and how they're expressing themselves. And you can't turn this off, right? It's like your emotional radar is just always scanning and picking up on people. And so this combination of your own emotional intensity and their emotional intensity can be difficult. It can set you up to try to be a caretaker and, know what someone else needs and make it right. And at the same time, that's really depleting. But the core of it is you are always in your feelings and you just feel so much in the world that it's really hard to protect yourself sometimes from that, because all those sensitivity triggers are just picking up everything happening in the world, especially around emotions. It makes you a beautiful, caring human being, but at the same time, it can be a lot of emotion to deal with all at once. And along those lines, because you are feeling things so much, we're often deeply moved by music and art and literature. We tend to take all of that on and really feel it in a deep way. And it doesn't matter if it's positive or negative, but we just tend to feel and express and carry those things. And it also makes it difficult for us to deal with conflict. We tend to not want to do that. We tend to want to avoid it. It can make us really sensitive to cruelty and criticism. And it can truly make it hard for us to watch, violent things on television or watch, horror movies, because that lingering violence and negativity and aggression isn't something we can just let go of. And so really these deep feelings affect us in every part of the way we interact with the world and the way the world interacts with us. Number 3 is that you are highly sensitive to subtle changes in your environment, right? So you're really sensitive to things like lighting and sound and texture, if those are shifting or changing. But at the core, we do have this oversensitivity to stimulation, and we're also over-reading and processing it, right? And so anything that has a subtle change, we are very aware of, and it can also be uncomfortable for us if it's a shift that doesn't align well with our sensitivities. Now, as a result of being deep processors and sensitive and all of those things, we tend to get easily overwhelmed. And so we feel flooded at times by all that we're picking up and all that we're feeling. And so stressful situations, chaotic environments, this tendency to notice everything, right? All of that can make us get flooded and feel overwhelmed. But it can feel very much like anxiety, in fact it often is, and this flood of just angsty intensity and or just emotional overwhelm that we truly can't really turn off. Number 5 is that if you are an HSP, you love and crave alone and downtime. This is where you re-regulate, you get yourself back on track emotionally. This is where you feel most at peace and you can be in your head and thinking and feeling about things. And you really do need this downtime to get yourself back on track, especially if you've been, overwhelmed, been in your head too much, been feeling too much. We need this alone time to re-center and ground ourselves. And it really can come from being around, stressful people, stressful environments, having to be around too many people. It does have ties to introversion, like I said, because, 70% of us are introverts. And so all of that social energy sometimes just is too much for us. But I would say even for those who are extroverted, we need that bit of some form of alone time, self-time, downtime to re-regulate emotionally and get ourselves back on track. And that's how we really truly feel most at ease and most peaceful in our dreamy sort of auto-regulation world, I think, too. Number 6 is that the research on HSPs shows that we are, as I'm saying, overly stimulated very easily. So whether it's the sound of something, the smell, the taste, the sights, our body pain, things like caffeine and alcohol, all of the research shows that we are just more easily stimulated by those things, right? That kind of circles back to, because we are deep processors, we are taking in sensory shifts. And so all of it is like this sweeping, constant assessment of things. And that can really boil over and be too much for us. And if these are, strong smells, like I'm saying, anything that creates a heightened awareness and sensitivity, we're really picking up on it. And therefore, we can get easily overly stimulated. Number 7 is that we are highly sensitive to shifts in our self-care regimen. And so because we often have a tendency to maybe not eat, we're sort of so far in our heads and doing things, we can get very hangry. I would say that being hungry is a huge trigger for HSPs. Not getting enough sleep is a huge trigger. Anything that interferes with our sense of grounding ourselves and well-being, from our basic self-care needs all the way up to our higher self-care needs, like mindfulness, meditation, quiet time, all of those things really affect us in a very significant way. And so it's not so simple for us to just have a snack. Why are you being so hangry? We really can't help it, because we are truly, responding to so many stimuli and cues, and that can make us overwhelmed when our body is depleted and not getting what it needs. If that were to instead be a profile of a type of autism, what I'm reading is that would reflect a person who would, let's say, identify as an HSP, who was unconsciously masking, who might also be highly masking in a way that they don't even know they have autism, but they have learned to make all of these adaptations because they have enough ability to understand certain types of social dynamics so that they know that having a meltdown wouldn't be appropriate, for example, to show that they were so dysregulated, let's say, inside by something in a sensory way, that they might go home and then shut down for the rest of the night, but they're not going to necessarily show that to you in what we have thought of as more of an autistic type of behavior. So basically, the profile reflects an emotional oversensitivity and is about unconscious masking. And that as a result of all of this, as I go through it, it talks about this profile especially being especially at risk for burnout. And burnout is basically, from my understanding, I'm going to also do a whole video on this, where for many people who have been masking their whole lives and just literally treading water to adjust and survive without drowning, that at some point it is so much that it basically forces a person at times to really lose capacity, to shut down, to become significantly overwhelmed in a way that affects functioning. And so you can imagine if, let's say, you are identifying with being a highly sensitive person, which I always have, right? That would explain the things that complex trauma wouldn't necessarily explain. And maybe it is. Maybe these are separate things. And HSP explains that with CPTSD, that I came out of the womb where you did sensitive. And then we landed in a very invalidating environment again and again and again. At the same time, when you start to kind of compare and overlap the profile of autism, especially at the core, which is so much about our sensory sensitivities, in fact, even more so than social communication dynamics, because what we're learning is that it's not a deficit to be autistic, a social deficit that you might have, your communication style. It is a difference. So you need to hold space for the idea that an autistic brain does not fit into the box of all the social worlds and all the social rules that have been constructed that said this is right and this is wrong and this is how we make a diagnosis. It doesn't make space for the fact that on this world and this planet, maybe we speak this language, but on this planet we speak that language, and neither one is wrong or right. And that also applies, as I mentioned, to the idea of empathy, that the way people might engage with each other, who, let's say, 2 autistic people versus 2 non-autistic people, there might be, and I think the research shows that there's something that's happening with, let's say, 2 of the same, that tend to have a better way of understanding each other, potentially, than, let's say, a different, an autistic person and a non-autistic person. So, these are the characteristics. Number 1, an intensity and depth of processing that reflects a rich and complex inner life and may manifest as complex imagery or deep theorizing about the world and people. And don't forget that for many people who are highly masking or autistic in general, one of their special interests is often people. That is the idea of it being psychology, like I mentioned, in the arts, if your special interest is understanding how humans are supposed to be in situations, you might become much better at that than someone whose interest was not that. But the way it might manifest, which is this common thing in HSPs, having a deep and interior world, that would be true, and it would look like this complex imagery and deep thinking about the world and yourself and others. Number 2, a high sensitivity to sensory input. So basically what we're saying is the HSP profile of autism would be very sensitive to things like pain, hunger, touch, fabrics, clutter, temperature, having a strong startle response, sensations, light, smells, and theirs and other people's intense emotions. So everything around the senses, the volume would be very high up, which is also true for HSPs. Number 3, a high perceptivity in picking up things that other people don't. So that's like being able to kind of like focus on things that others might not notice. Number 4, needing accommodations for your sensitivities. But then again, if you were basically unconsciously masking, so you're an HSP autistic, but you don't know that, you're unconsciously masking and making all these adjustments in the world to show up in a certain way to get through it. But maybe you do things without realizing it, like you only buy clothing without tags. You only can use certain kind of perfumes or smells. So you basically set up your world through what you're thinking are preferences, but really they're ways of kind of accommodating for basically what are difficult triggers for you potentially. Number 5, needing advanced notice to prepare for sensory sensitivities. And we've talked a lot about the HSP world being highly reactive to stress, that let's say unpredictable situations, things we can't control, that all of that would make it more difficult. So the idea is that oftentimes those who have autism will say, if I know what to expect going into it, I tend to do well. And I think that's true for most of us. I think especially we all have, wherever we are in terms of our brains, have little things we like and don't like. And being like surprised by something we don't enjoy or like, most of us don't do well with that. It's just a matter of degree. And I would say for those who have heightened sensitivities, that would be the case. The next one is enjoyment of fine scents, tastes, sounds, smells, art, things like that. And that's another one of the signs of HSPs, is this appreciation for the beauty of life, right? For this like parts of beauty and enjoyment for the sake of what they are, like an awareness of that, a sensitivity to that, an appreciation for that. Number 7, hyperempathy with a tendency to be easily affected by others' moods. Now we know that's also part of HSP. So, and also complex trauma. We learn to pay a lot of attention to what other people are doing and thinking and feeling, and we can take that and absorb that. And in fact, there are those on the spectrum who have hyperempathy, I think, as I said earlier. So when you're hyperempathic, there's no barrier. The volume is way up. And where there should ideally be a barrier, there isn't one. And I've talked about this a lot.
Autism and complex PTSD. Autism spectrum disorders and complex post-traumatic stress disorders, CPTSD, have similar symptoms and appear to be highly connected in many ways. However, the root causes are different.
Trying to understand the overlap and relationship between complex PTSD and autism. And even when I look at the different graphs and the other work of people, the more and more I read, the more this overlap continues to sort of show itself around complex trauma and autism. Lack of data informing the DSM-5, which is what we basically have been using for quite some time on this diagnosis, which left out populations really mostly other than white males. And the way they've discerned what is the appropriate diagnostic criteria, it appears that it's very flawed to hold that up as the definitive way to diagnose ASD, especially in what it appears to be more high masking or different populations. So that being said, I just want to say that I am pulling from autistic voices I'm listening to on YouTube, on TikTok. I'm listening to podcasts. I'm listening to, as much as I can get my hands on and still manage the rest of my life. I'm looking at research articles, I'm looking at, all types of resources. But it's not the case that you can only pull from the perfect research, which, by the way, doesn't exist. So please keep in mind that I try to link things that have researched articles, but also I'm going to be using the voices that are often referenced within the autistic community who may or may not be experts in terms of, doctoral level, master's level, whatever, in academia, but who are very valuable and very informed and frankly very researched people to listen to. So as we're now going to talk about where is the overlap between autism and complex trauma, what I'm finding very quickly is that in many cases it is very hard to tell. Of course, there are some dynamics that tend to align more significantly with each of these, like you must have had a trauma or relational trauma for CPTSD versus ASD being a neurodevelopmental disorder that you're basically born with. Even the word disorder I'm learning not to use. A difference, a neurodivergent or developmental difference. What I'm finding is that complex trauma and autism seem to hold hands, and I think I've said that already in a few videos. So even as I made this list, when I did the overlap, and then I created this similarities and differences, in many cases, when I got to similarities and differences, I could actually find overlapping data in certain situations, listening to certain voices as well. But what I want to understand, and this is kind of how I'm trying to approach it, using myself, is for someone, if you relate to this, somebody who, like me, has had a lot of sensory issues, social dynamic issues, friendship issues, in terms of, wanting to isolate a lot, struggling with certain dynamics. How would I understand if I was born with, let's say, ASD versus being born highly sensitive, not the HSP profile of autism I just posted, but if I was going to make the argument, no, it's not ASD, you just came out of the womb highly sensitive and you had a very invalidating environment, how would you try to differentiate that between, no, you actually were born with some level of being on the spectrum, and then, of course, the inherent trauma of being on the spectrum oftentimes alongside actually complicated relational trauma in your family system? How would all of that play out today? And at the end of the day, I want to say this, that labels, I think, matter and don't matter. In some regards, I think, a label gives us validation of like, this is the thing I've been struggling with. Stop blaming myself. And the way I'm approaching this exposing myself, I should say, around ASD is that if at the end of the day, I just land on the word neurodivergent, and we know that complex trauma and certain experiences create neurodivergency because they require our brains to function in different ways. But learning all of this, what it's really doing is validating the alien status and why does everything bother me so much? And why have I set up my life in all of these ways now? But even more importantly, where do I want to go from here? Because so many things do feel so difficult for my nervous system all of the time, and they always have. Let's get into the overlap. I'm going to assume that you already understand the core features of autism versus complex trauma. But at the heart, we're talking about how our bodies are going to be responding to the environment. And I'm really talking about hypervigilance, social dynamics, empathy, emotions, self-emotion regulation issues, how you sort of manage everything in your internal and external world, especially around, like I've talked about, things like toxic hypervigilance, tendencies to isolate, raging anxiety, which are often very common, can be common in both of those disorders, but not necessarily. All right, so the overlap is here. Number one, feeling different, feeling like an alien, like no one gets you. So both trauma and autism can do that. Number two, easily being dysregulated, whether you show it or not, overwhelmed and triggered. So it's like your nervous system, your responsiveness to things can be very intense. And remember, if you were highly masking, you might have already learned that you can't have that meltdown show, that dysregulation at work, let's say. But when you get in your car, or maybe you have a meltdown in your car, you cry, or when you get home, you become numb and you shut down, or your whole weekend is numbed out as a response. So it doesn't have to necessarily be mirrored in that moment. Number 3, trying to find or using some form of self-soothing behaviors. Often using the word stimming, we often use the word stimming in autism, but the idea is that stimming for those with autism may be pleasurable, it may help regulate the responses to things, the world, emotions, senses, and that it serves a purpose for the person with autism. And I think the same thing can be true as I've researched in different forms for those who have complex trauma. It's a way to find a way to soothe the self. If you think about attachment and a child who didn't get, let's say, any kind of real regulatory behavior from a parent to self-soothe, that child might engage in all types of self-regulatory soothing behaviors. Number 4, a tendency to want control, to prefer predictability, which then increases a sense of internal safety. So like being prepared and knowing what to expect, let's say going into a social event, would be just forget about the social thing to a new event. In both cases, it would ideally help prepare the person inside and out to kind of have an idea about what's happening. So being startled by what happens, being surprised, unprepared, feeling unsafe as a result would be an issue. So it would be preferable to kind of have that predictability. Number 5, engaging in restricted or avoidant behaviors as a way of managing what might be the dysregulation that's coming in as input. Number 6, hypervigilance. So for those with CPTSD, there could be, especially as it relates to the actual trauma, some types of environmental triggers, but there can also be this internal hypervigilant forecasting. And really what we're talking about in both cases in different ways is an overly reactive nervous system. Now, obviously, how it originates, let's say, in a purely ASD dynamic versus you had a situation, you experienced trauma, it might be more, I think with complex trauma, the triggers may or may not be more specific, but I would argue that if the human being in your life, like a parent, is the person who caused the trauma, that often gets layered out to like all humans are traumatic. And then maybe the parent has ASD, right? So like there's all these layers, but the point is your nervous system is overly reactive in both cases. Number 7, having obsessive thoughts or behaviors, very common in both, can be. Number 8, concentration, focus, attention issues, and having either hyperfocus or hypofocus, where it's like either way there's a role that attention can play or not play in helping you manage the way your mind and body are responding to the situations. Number 9, dissociation and derealization are common in both ASD and CPTSD. Both of them can have profiles of being hyper empathic. So, but being hyper empathic can be one of those dynamics. The next one is fawning, and I came across this in Dr. Devin Price's book on unmasking autism, talking about for high masking individuals, how engaging in fawning behavior is a self-preservation and regulatory way of engaging in the world. So learning to read others, rotate around them, find a way, especially if you were aware enough to know that a meltdown wasn't going to be socially acceptable, especially as you got older, that learning to kind of rotate around others and get your needs met by being less of a threat to the threat, which could be kids at school, parents, things like that, that fawning is a survival tactic in complex trauma and really in a different version, but kind of the same way in autism. And I would say the next one is a trauma response of freezing. So collapsing and shutting down for different reasons, though, that is really a response to our nervous system. But in both cases, we can see freezing and collapsing. Number 13, intimacy issues. And so I think for different reasons, those can show up. I think at the heart of complex trauma is often a lack of trust in humans. And I could see how, although I'm still, this is a newer area for me, but if the way people have responded to you hasn't felt safe or hasn't felt validating on the autism side, or maybe you have sensory triggers around smells. This to me is a huge piece of physical intimacy I'm wondering about that I really want to explore is if you have a lot of triggers around smells and touch and light and fabric and all of those things, and you think about the complicated nature of humans interacting in an intimate way, there are potentially a lot of triggers. At least that's something I'm understanding more and more about. And The next one is an increased risk of victimization, which makes sense. There's a lack of maybe awareness, or there's a vulnerability inherently built into both complex trauma. Oftentimes those who are traumatized in childhood find themselves, reenacting and being repeatedly traumatized. And then I'm learning in autism as a result of certain maybe differences or lack of understanding certain things, or being very naive and very trusting. One of the characteristics I've come across is people saying, I was so naive. And I have said that so many times. Like, I think I'm a relatively smart person, but when it comes to sort of really close people in my life, I always assume the best. I never assume the worst, in times when I should have. Or when I should have been more suspicious, I would write it off as, I want to respect boundaries. But I don't know how you feel about that, so please share if you want to. Number 15, heightened sensitivities to sensory input. So that kind of really goes along with hypervigilance, but just the idea that when you've had a repetitively traumatic childhood, you learn to make meaning of things, to pay attention to things, to focus on the sensory things, like what's the sound of the parent's voice, what mood are they in, what kind of facial expressions do they have they been drinking or not, like all kinds of things. And so there's like a tenderness around that now you're living in fight or flight. So there's like a tenderness around everything coming at you. And that would be the heart, I believe, in many cases for those who have autism, just from the get-go. The sensory profile for those with ASD, their baseline sensitivities are going to be generally higher. I think that the sensory processing, as I'm learning, is actually in many cases a much larger piece, or as large as social differences, not deficits, but differences for people. That baseline kind of being that nervous system, that responsiveness, that we're taking in when we have autism, like everything at once, and that there's a natural overwhelm. Now let's talk about the similarities. So for those, this is kind of going back to that overlapping dynamic where there can be social difficulties for different reasons, as I've talked about with complex trauma. If you have a very heightened active nervous system as a result of needing to really overread your caregivers, and then you have an inner critic and an outer critic, all of that can be hovering over you in social situations and be very uncomfortable. And then inherently there can be this different language being spoken with neurotypicals and neurodiverse individuals and their own tolerance for engaging socially. So those can both happen for similar and different reasons. Number 2, I would say flashbacks are inherently a complex trauma thing as we think about diagnostic criteria. An emotional flashback, like a return state, regressive state to childhood, but I don't see how in autism you couldn't also have, if you also have complex trauma, emotional flashbacks, especially to triggers, not just around your own experience, but to things that inherently created this alien feeling for you, where you weren't seen and heard the way that you needed to be. So you could have you could feel shame, you could feel triggered. I don't see how you couldn't. Self-blame, and that I think that can often overlap for different reasons based on your interactions with other people and your history. A shift in how you experience emotion. So ideally in complex trauma, there would be a shift, but if you're born with autism, of course, that shift in how you experience emotion may be inherently part of who you are. And then I can see how it might be shaped by whether or not you received the support that you needed and deserved. And then avoidance for different reasons, avoidance of people, of experiences, of whatever, based on the related reason. So obviously there could be an intolerance inside for certain things from a sort of nervous system perspective with autism, and one that maybe you weren't born with but developed as a result of complex trauma. So those are the places where I think we find the similarities and differences and overlap. And as you can see, there are some things that feel they would inherently be more related to autism versus complex trauma. And then there are a lot of places where it just kind of like it can get overlapped and really nuanced and really difficult to decide, well, what is the etiology of this? Where does this come from? And given the fact that childhood and trauma and our brains, it's such, and our environments are all just at all times impacting each other, I think it can get difficult.